At their wedding, his fiancée yanked the maid's chair away in front of 200 guests. Then the billionaire stopped her. Hey, stop scrolling for a second. Imagine this. 200 guests. Crystal chandeliers. A wedding dress worth more than most people's homes. And in one single second, a woman in a blue maid's uniform hits the marble floor, pushed down by the bride herself. Everyone gasped. Nobody moved. Nobody, except one man. The groom. And what he did next didn't just shock the room. It changed 3 lives forever. Stay with me, because the real story hasn't even started yet. Hey everyone. Welcome back to the channel. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from today? Which country do you call home? Drop in the comments. I read every single one. Today's story is about pride, betrayal, and a kindness so quiet nobody noticed it until it saved a man's entire life. This one will make you feel something. Trust me. Let's get into it. Nobody in that ballroom knew her real name. Grace Whitfield had been working as catering staff for the Marbury Grand Hotel for almost 3 years. Blue dress, white apron, hair pinned back, so tight it gave her a headache by noon. She was 26 years old, and on paper, she was nobody special, just another face carrying trays of champagne through rooms she could never afford to rent. But Grace had a secret nobody at that wedding knew. 7 years ago, on a cold October night in Ohio, a 19-year-old boy named Ethan Cole had been sitting on the edge of a bridge outside of Columbus, soaked from the rain, completely broke, completely alone, after his father's business collapsed and took the family's entire life savings with it. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. He had nowhere to go. And he had made a decision that night that he never told another living soul about. A stranger stopped her car. A young woman, maybe 19 herself, wearing a diner uniform with a name tag that said Grace. She didn't call the police. She didn't lecture him. She just sat down next to him on that freezing curb, took off her own jacket, put it around his shoulders, and said the words that saved his life. Whatever this is, it's not the end of your story. I promise you that. She bought him a sandwich from the all-night diner where she worked. She gave him $20, everything she had in her pocket that night, and made him promise to call his mother. Then she got back in her car and drove away, and Ethan never saw her again. He never forgot her face. He never forgot her voice. For 7 years, as he clawed his way up from nothing, 3 jobs, community college at night, a business idea that finally caught fire, until Ethan Cole became a name whispered in boardrooms across the country, he carried one photograph in his wallet. Not of a family member. Not of a girlfriend. A blurry photo he'd taken of a diner receipt with her name scrawled on it in pen. Grace. He had searched for her, quietly for years. Private investigators. Old employee records from diners across Ohio that had long since closed down. Nothing ever came of it. Eventually, he told himself she was a memory he'd have to live with, not a person he'd ever find again. Today, Ethan Cole was 31 years old, worth more money than entire towns, and about to marry Vanessa Hale, the daughter of a real estate mogul, a woman as polished and sharp as the diamond on her finger. Everyone said they were the perfect match. 2 empires joining hands. Nobody knew that 3 days before the wedding, Ethan had stood in his office at 2 a.m., staring at that same crumpled receipt, wondering why his chest felt so hollow when he thought about walking down that aisle. And nobody, not Ethan, not Vanessa, not a single guest in that grand ballroom, knew that the maid quietly filling water glasses at table 12 was the same woman who once saved a stranger's life on a bridge in Ohio. Grace didn't recognize him either. Not at first. 7 years had changed his face, filled it out, sharpened it, dressed it in a tailored tuxedo instead of a soaked hoodie. She was simply doing her job, trying to get through her shift, trying not to think about her mother's medical bills piling up at home, the real reason she still worked events like this instead of chasing the nursing degree she'd once dreamed of. She had no idea that in less than an hour, her whole world, and his, was about to collide in front of 200 witnesses. The ceremony had gone perfectly. Too perfectly, some might say. Vanessa Hale walked down the aisle in a gown that had taken 11 months to design, her smile camera-ready, her eyes scanning the crowd not for Ethan's face, but for which cameras were catching her best angle. She said her vows with practiced warmth. Ethan said his with something quieter, something that looked, if you watched closely enough, like a man trying to convince himself he felt what he was supposed to feel. Nobody watched that closely, though. Weddings like this weren't about feelings. They were about performance. The reception spilled into the Marbury Grand's largest ballroom, gold Chiavari chairs, white orchids flown in from 3 different countries, a string quartet playing softly beneath the chatter of 200 of the city's wealthiest guests. Grace moved through the room quietly, refilling glasses, clearing plates, invisible in the way service staff are trained to be invisible. She hadn't planned on lingering near the head table. But one of the bridesmaids had knocked over a center house of candles near table 12, and Grace had been sent to fix it before the first dance began. She knelt down, gathering wax and glass, when she heard Vanessa's voice cut sharply through the music. "Excuse me. You. Move." Grace looked up. Vanessa was staring at her the way someone stares at a stain on a white tablecloth. "I need this chair for my sister," Vanessa said, gesturing toward the empty seat Grace happened to be crouched beside. "You're blocking my aisle for photos. Get up." "Of course, ma'am." "I'm sorry," Grace said, standing quickly, reaching to steady the chair before stepping aside. But Vanessa wasn't finished. Maybe it was the champagne. Maybe it was the exhaustion of performing Perfect Bride for 6 straight hours. Maybe it was something uglier that had always lived under her polished surface. Whatever it was, something in Vanessa snapped. "I said move," she repeated, louder this time. Loud enough that nearby tables turned. And before Grace could fully step back, Vanessa grabbed the chair Grace's hand was still resting on and yanked it, hard, pulling it out from under her. Grace hit the marble floor in front of 200 guests. For a moment, the entire ballroom went silent. The string quartet faltered mid-note. Someone gasped near the back. A photographer's flash went off, capturing the moment permanently. Grace on the ground, humiliation burning across her face, Vanessa standing over her in crimson silk, not even reaching down to help. "Watch where you're kneeling next time," Vanessa said coolly, smoothing her dress as if nothing had happened, already turning to find her sister a different seat. That's when a voice cut through the room, low, controlled, but carrying an edge sharp enough that every guest instinctively turned toward it. "Vanessa, stop." It was Ethan. He was already moving across the dance floor, tuxedo jacket forgotten somewhere behind him, eyes locked not on his new wife, but on the woman still sitting on the marble floor. And as he got closer, as she lifted her face, startled, embarrassed, trying to gather herself, something in his chest went completely still. He knew that face. 7 years older. Different uniform. Same eyes. "Grace," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the murmuring crowd. And Grace, still sitting on the cold floor of a ballroom she didn't belong in, looked up at the groom. The billionaire, the man every newspaper in the city had written about for a week, and felt her stomach drop as recognition finally clicked into place. The boy from the bridge. All grown up. Getting married. Standing right in front of her. For a moment, Ethan forgot there were 200 people watching him. He forgot he was standing in his wedding tuxedo, minutes into his marriage. He forgot Vanessa was even there. He knelt down on the marble floor beside Grace, ignoring the gasps, ignoring the whispers rippling through the crowd, and gently helped her to her feet. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice low, urgent, nothing like the composed businessman the world knew. "I'm fine," Grace said quickly, mortified, trying to pull her hand back. "Please, sir, I need to get back to." "Grace," he said again, and this time it wasn't a question. It was recognition, disbelief, 7 years of searching crashing into a single moment. "It's you. It's really you." Vanessa's face had shifted from irritation to confusion to something colder. "Ethan, what are you doing? Do you know this woman?" The room had gone almost silent now. The string quartet stopped completely, every guest leaning in, phones quietly rising to capture whatever was unfolding. Ethan turned to face his bride, and for the first time that day, his voice shook, not with nervousness, but with something closer to grief. 7 years ago, I was sitting on a bridge outside Columbus. I had nothing left. No money, no home, nowhere to go, and I made a decision that night that I'm not proud of. He paused, his throat tightening. A stranger stopped. She gave me her jacket. She bought me food with money she didn't have to spare. She told me my story wasn't over. And then she disappeared, and I spent years trying to find her to say thank you. He looked back at Grace, tears now openly in his eyes. I never got the chance. Until right now. A wave of shocked murmurs swept through the ballroom. Vanessa's face had gone pale, then flushed with something sharper. Humiliation, fury, the dawning realization that she had just publicly shoved to the ground the one person who had once saved her fiancé's life. That's absurd, Vanessa stammered, forcing a laugh that no one joined. Ethan, she's catering staff. You cannot possibly. She saved my life, Vanessa. Ethan's voice was steady now, quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. While you were choosing floral arrangements and seating charts, this woman, a stranger who owed me nothing, chose kindness when nobody was watching. And today, in front of everyone, you chose cruelty. The silence that followed was the loudest sound in the room. Grace stood frozen, her heart pounding, painfully aware of every eye on her, every phone camera capturing a moment she never asked to be part of. This wasn't what she wanted. Not attention, not confrontation, not the unraveling of a stranger's marriage. Please, she said quietly, mostly to Ethan, you don't have to do this. It's your wedding day. No, Ethan said, shaking his head slowly, looking at Vanessa in a way that told the whole room something had just permanently broken. It was my wedding day. Vanessa's mother rushed forward, whispering urgently, trying to smooth over what was quickly becoming an unrecoverable scene. But Vanessa wasn't looking at her mother. She was staring at Ethan with an expression caught between disbelief and dawning panic, realizing in real time that the marriage she'd spent a year planning down to the last orchid petal might be unraveling in front of the very audience she'd invited to witness her triumph. And Grace, the maid nobody had noticed an hour ago, suddenly found herself standing at the center of the biggest scandal the city's elite would talk about for months. She had no idea this was only the beginning. The next 20 minutes felt like a fever dream to Grace. Ethan asked the wedding planner to pause the reception. He asked hotel security to escort concerned family members to a private room. He didn't raise his voice again. He didn't need to. The quiet authority in the way he moved told everyone in that ballroom that whatever was happening, it was far from over. Vanessa followed him into a small side room off the ballroom, her voice climbing with every step. You're going to throw away everything. Our family's companies, the merger, everything we built, over some waitress who did you a favor 7 years ago? Some favor? Ethan turned to face her, and for the first time, Grace, who had been quietly ushered into the same room by a nervous wedding coordinator unsure what else to do with her, saw real anger in his eyes. She kept me from jumping off a bridge, Vanessa. She's the reason I'm standing here at all. And you just humiliated her in front of 200 people because she was in your way. I didn't know who she was, Vanessa snapped. That's exactly the problem, Ethan said quietly. It shouldn't matter who she is. You shoved a human being onto the floor because you decided her comfort mattered less than yours. That's not a mistake, Vanessa. That's who you are. The room went silent. Even Vanessa, for once, had nothing sharp enough to say back. Grace stood near the door, arms wrapped around herself, wishing more than anything that the floor would simply open up and let her disappear. I should go, she said softly. I have other tables. I'll lose my job if I... You're not going anywhere, Ethan said, turning to her, his voice gentling instantly. Not until I've said what I've needed to say for 7 years. He walked closer, and for a moment, it was just the two of them, the noise of the unraveling wedding fading into the background. You told me my story wasn't over, he said quietly. I didn't believe you that night. I thought you were just being kind to a stranger you'd never see again. But I kept that receipt with your name on it in my wallet for 7 years, Grace. Every time I doubted myself, every failed pitch, every rejection, every night I wondered if I was fooling myself, I took it out and read your name and remembered that a complete stranger believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. Grace felt her eyes fill with tears she hadn't expected. I didn't even know if you made it, she admitted. I thought about you sometimes. I hoped you were okay. I'm more than okay because of you, Ethan said. And today, I watched the woman I was about to marry treat you like you were less than human, and I realized something I think I've known for a while now, if I'm honest with myself. He paused. I was about to spend my life with someone who looks at kindness like it's weakness. And that's not the life I want. Not after everything you taught me on that bridge, without even trying to teach me anything at all. Behind them, Vanessa's voice rose again, arguing with her mother, already spinning a version of events for the guests still waiting outside. But Ethan wasn't listening anymore. He was looking at Grace the way a man looks at someone he thought he'd lost forever, and found again in the last place he ever expected. Words spread through the ballroom faster than anyone could contain it. By the time Ethan walked back out alone, without Vanessa beside him, the 200 guests had already pieced together fragments of the story from whispers, from a few blurry phone videos, from Vanessa's own mother's panicked explanations. The wedding, everyone now understood, was over. Not postponed. Over. Ethan stood at the front of the room, the same spot where he'd said his vows less than 2 hours earlier, and for a moment, he simply let the silence settle. Then he spoke, his voice steady despite everything. I owe all of you an apology for how this evening has gone, he said. But I don't owe anyone an apology for stopping what happened here today. 7 years ago, a stranger saved my life when I had absolutely nothing to offer her in return. Today, I watched that same woman get treated like she was invisible, like her dignity didn't matter, in a room full of people who claimed to value kindness and character. He paused, looking out at the crowd. If we can't extend basic human respect to the people serving us dinner, then all the money in this room means nothing at all. Some guests nodded slowly. Others looked deeply uncomfortable, aware that many of them had walked past Grace and the other staff all evening without a second glance. Grace, still standing near the side of the room, wanted desperately to leave, to slip out unnoticed the way she'd been trained to for 3 years. But the hotel's catering manager, a stern woman named Denise who Grace had always been slightly afraid of, was staring at her now with an expression Grace couldn't quite read. You're the one who stopped Mr. Cole from? Denise started, then stopped herself, glancing nervously toward Ethan. You saved his life. I didn't know who he was, Grace said quietly. I just saw someone who needed help. Denise studied her for a long moment. You've worked for this company for 3 years. Perfect record. Never a single complaint. She hesitated. I should have protected you tonight. I'm sorry I didn't. Grace nodded, throat tight, unable to find words. Across the room, Ethan was quietly speaking with hotel security, arranging for Grace's shift to be covered, for her to be paid in full for the entire event despite everything that had happened. Then he crossed the ballroom toward her, ignoring the stares, ignoring the murmurs, ignoring everything except the woman he'd spent 7 years hoping to find again. Can I take you somewhere quieter? He asked. Not to talk about tonight. Just to talk. If you'll let me. Grace hesitated. Every instinct told her this was too much, too fast, too strange. The man from the bridge was somehow also a groom whose wedding had just collapsed in front of 200 witnesses, and she was still wearing a wrinkled catering uniform with wax on her knees. But underneath the shock, underneath the exhaustion, there was something else. A quiet, persistent feeling that told her this moment, however strange, however impossible, mattered. Okay, she said softly. Just to talk. Behind them, Vanessa stood at the edge of the ballroom, watching the man she'd almost married walk away with a woman she dismissed as invisible less than an hour earlier, and for the first time in her life, Vanessa Hale understood exactly what she had lost, and exactly why. They ended up on the hotel's rooftop terrace, far above the chaos still unfolding in the ballroom below. The city lights spread out around them, and for a long while, neither of them spoke. Grace pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, the October wind sharper up here, though nothing like the cold night on that Ohio bridge 7 years ago. I have to ask, she finally said. Why didn't you ever try to find me? You said you looked. I did look, Ethan said. For years. Old diner records, employee rosters, anything I could find. The diner closed down about 2 years after that night. Most of the paperwork was gone. I hired 3 different investigators over the years. Nothing ever turned up. He shook his head, almost laughing at the impossibility of it. And then tonight, of all nights, you're kneeling by table 12 fixing spilled candle wax. I needed the extra shifts, Grace admitted. My mom's been sick. Medical bills. I picked up every event I could this year. Something in Ethan's expression shifted. Concern. Immediate and genuine. Is she okay? She's stable. For now. Grace looked out over the city skyline. I was going to go back to school for nursing. I had to put it off. Life got in the way, I guess. Ethan was quiet for a moment. You changed the entire direction of my life in 20 minutes on a bridge, and you never even got my name that night.
Did you know that?
Grace shook her head. I didn't need it. I just needed you to be okay. That's who you are, Ethan said softly. You gave a stranger your jacket and your last $20 and didn't think twice about it. And tonight, a woman who had everything money could buy couldn't be bothered to help you up off the floor. Grace looked down, uncomfortable. You don't have to keep bringing that up. I do, actually, Ethan said. Because it told me everything I needed to know about who I almost married, and it reminded me exactly who I want to become. He turned to face her fully. I built a company on the idea that people matter more than profit. I have donated more money to shelters and food banks in this city than I've ever told a single reporter about, specifically because of what you did for me. But somewhere along the way, I forgot to actually live by that in my own life. I let myself get talked into a marriage that looked perfect on paper and felt hollow in every way that mattered. That's a lot to realize in one night, Grace said quietly. It is, Ethan admitted. But some things take 7 years to become clear, and some things take 20 minutes. He hesitated, choosing his next words carefully. I'm not asking you for anything tonight, Grace. I know this is strange and overwhelming and probably the last thing you expected walking into your shift this evening. I just want the chance to know you, really know you, not as the stranger from the bridge, as Grace. For the first time since she'd hit that marble floor, Grace felt something loosen in her chest. Not quite hope, not yet, but something close to it. Okay, she said. Let's start there. The story didn't stay contained to that rooftop, of course. By morning, video clips from the reception had spread across social media. The moment Vanessa pulled the chair, the moment Ethan crossed the dance floor, fragments of his speech to the stunned guests. News outlets picked it up by noon. Billionaire groom halts wedding to defend server who saved his life years ago. One headline read. Another called it the chair that ended a merger and a marriage. Grace hated the attention. She'd spent her whole life avoiding spotlight, and suddenly her face was on entertainment blogs next to captions calling her everything from mystery maid to guardian angel. She stopped checking her phone by the second day, overwhelmed by messages from people she hadn't spoken to in years, reporters requesting interviews, even a few unkind comments from people questioning her motives. They think I planned this, she told Ethan over coffee at a quiet cafe 3 days later, one of the only places they could sit without being immediately recognized. Like I somehow orchestrated falling on a marble floor at your wedding. Ignore them, Ethan said. People will believe whatever story is easiest for them. The truth is boring compared to gossip. The truth is that your fiancé pushed me, and you happen to recognize me, Grace said. That's it. That's the whole story. That's not the whole story, Ethan said gently. The whole story started 7 years ago on a bridge, and it's still being written. Grace looked down at her coffee, unsure how to respond. Despite everything, despite the strangeness of the situation, she'd found herself looking forward to these quiet conversations more than she wanted to admit. Ethan wasn't what she expected from a billionaire. He didn't talk about his company or his money. He asked about her mother's health, remembered small details from their conversations, showed up with soup from her favorite diner when her mother had a rough week. Meanwhile, Vanessa had gone quiet publicly, releasing one brief statement through a publicist calling the events of that evening a private matter before disappearing from the social scene entirely. Word around the city was that her family's real estate merger with Ethan's company had collapsed within 48 hours, costing both families millions. Some blamed Ethan. Most, especially after the video clip circulated, understood exactly why the wedding had ended the way it did. "Can I ask you something?" Grace said one evening, weeks into their growing friendship, as they walked along the river near her apartment. "Do you regret it? Ending things the way you did, in front of everyone?" Ethan considered the question seriously before answering. "I regret that it took a public moment like that for me to see clearly what I should have seen months earlier. I don't regret standing up when it mattered." He glanced at her. "Do you regret stopping for a stranger on a bridge 7 years ago? Even though it changed your whole life too, in ways you never expected?" Grace smiled, the first easy smile she'd allowed herself in weeks.
"No.
I'd do it again in a heartbeat." "Then maybe," Ethan said quietly, "we're both exactly where we're supposed to be." Winter came, and with it came changes neither of them had fully anticipated. Ethan quietly paid off Grace's mother's remaining medical bills, not as a grand gesture, not with cameras or announcements, but through an anonymous donation to the hospital that Grace only discovered when the billing department called to confirm her mother's account had been closed out. When she confronted him about it, furious that he'd done something so significant without asking, he simply said, "You gave me everything you had when you had nothing to spare. I have more than enough. Let me do this one thing." She also learned, almost by accident, that Ethan had spent the last 5 years quietly funding scholarships for nursing students at 3 different community colleges across Ohio, long before he ever found her again. When she asked him why, he admitted the truth simply, "Because someone once told me my story wasn't over, and I wanted to make sure other people's stories didn't end too early either, if I could help it." Grace enrolled back in her nursing program that spring, using savings she finally didn't have to spend on her mother's care. She kept her apartment. She kept her independence. She made it clear to Ethan, more than once, that she wasn't interested in being rescued, only in being seen, and he respected that boundary without ever pushing past it, which, more than any grand gesture, was what slowly won her trust. Not everyone was happy about the growing relationship. Ethan's board members worried about public perception. Old colleagues from Vanessa's circle whispered that Grace was after his money, despite the fact that she'd flatly refused every expensive gift he'd tried to offer beyond the medical bills, insisting on paying her own rent, buying her own groceries, living the same modest life she'd always lived. "They don't understand," Ethan told her one night. "They think this is about money. It was never about money. It's about the fact that you were kind to me when kindness cost you something, and now I get to be part of your life without it costing either of us anything at all." Grace's mother, meeting Ethan for the first time over a home-cooked dinner in her small kitchen, not a restaurant, not anywhere fancy, because Ethan had specifically asked to come there, took his hand at the end of the evening and said quietly, "My daughter has a good heart.
She always has.
I'm glad someone finally saw it the way it deserves to be seen." It wasn't a fairy tale. There were hard conversations, uncertain weeks, moments where Grace wondered if the difference in their worlds was simply too vast to bridge. But slowly, carefully, something real began to grow between them. Not built on a wedding day gone wrong, but on 7 years of an unspoken promise finally being honored. A year after that night in the ballroom, Grace stood in her nursing scrubs at the end of a 12-hour hospital shift, exhausted in the good way that comes from meaningful work. She'd graduated top of her class. She'd taken a position at the same hospital that had once cared for her mother, determined to give back the kind of care that had saved her family. Ethan had changed too, in quieter ways. He stepped back from some of the more aggressive expansion plans at his company, redirecting resources toward the community programs he'd always cared about but rarely spoke of publicly. He started visiting the diner, the one that had replaced the old one where Grace used to work, standing on the same street corner. Every October, a quiet ritual neither of them ever needed to explain to anyone else. They didn't rush anything. There was no dramatic proposal at a red carpet event, no press release, No attempt to turn their story into another headline. When Ethan finally asked Grace to marry him, it happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening in her small apartment kitchen, while she was still in scrubs and he was still in a wrinkled work shirt, neither of them dressed for anything more special than dinner. "I don't need the ballroom," he told her, kneeling on her kitchen floor instead of a marble one. "I don't need 200 guests or a dress that costs more than a house. I just need you exactly like this, exactly as you are." Grace, laughing through unexpected tears, said yes. Their wedding, when it finally happened 6 months later, looked nothing like the one that had collapsed in that grand ballroom a year earlier. It was small, 40 guests, mostly family, and the hospital co-workers who had become close friends, held in a modest garden behind Grace's mother's house. There were no Chiavari chairs, no orchids flown in from other countries, no cameras capturing every angle for magazines. But when it came time for the toasts, Ethan stood up, looked at the woman beside him, and said the only words that mattered. "7 years ago, a stranger told me my story wasn't over. She was right. And every day since the night I found her again, I've woken up grateful that some kindness in this world is patient enough to wait for the right moment to be repaid." There wasn't a dry eye among the 40 guests. Grace's mother cried the hardest of all. Somewhere across the city, in a life that had moved on in its own direction, Vanessa Hale read about the small, quiet wedding in a brief entertainment column and closed the article without finishing it, no longer angry, simply aware, in the distant way time allows, of a lesson she'd learned the hardest way possible, that dignity costs nothing to give and everything to lose. 5 years later, Grace stood in the pediatric ward of the hospital where she now worked as head nurse, adjusting the blanket on a young patient's bed before her shift ended. Ethan waited in the hallway, their 4-year-old daughter asleep against his shoulder, having come straight from the small community center they'd built together, funded quietly, without press coverage, offering meals and shelter and support to anyone who needed it, no questions asked. They never spoke publicly about the wedding that never happened or the wedding that did. They didn't need to. Their story had traveled far enough on its own, not because of scandal, but because people remembered, years later, the simple truth at its center, that a moment of kindness, offered freely to a stranger who could never repay it, had rippled forward through years neither of them could have predicted, touching lives neither of them would ever fully know about. Sometimes, late at night, Grace would think back to that cold October evening on the bridge, how close everything had come to ending there, how differently every single day since could have unfolded. And she would think of the marble ballroom floor, the humiliation, the fear, the strange, impossible collision of past and present that had somehow led her here, to this life, to this family, to a purpose she had chosen for herself and built with her own 2 hands. The lesson was never really about wealth, or weddings, or dramatic public reckonings. It was simpler than that, and truer than that. It was this: you never know, in the ordinary moments of your life, which small act of kindness might be the one that changes everything, for someone else, or for yourself. The stranger on the bridge, the maid on the ballroom floor, the billionaire who never forgot. None of them set out to write a story that would matter to anyone else. They simply chose, again and again, to be decent when it would have been easier not to be. If this story moved you tonight, if it reminded you that kindness still matters even when nobody's watching, I want you to do 3 things for me. Hit that like button because it genuinely helps the story reach more people who need to hear it. Subscribe to the channel because there are so many more stories like this one waiting to be told. And share this with someone in your life who needs a reminder tonight that their story isn't over yet either, no matter how dark the moment feels right now. Thank you for staying until the very end. I'll see you in the next story.